Okay. Hi, everybody. I hope you're well. We're going to continue along in the Kuzari today, picking up from our discussion about Rebbe Akiva that we really spent a lot of time on yesterday. Not yesterday, last week. And I hope that that was an informative discussion for you, because we really went into some deep material about the four who entered into the Pardes, and why Rebbe Akiva, why that story of entering into the Pardes really ties into Rebbe Akiva's death, and why he was so prepared to give up his life al Kiddush Hashem. Perhaps it was because of the perspectives that he gained while in that Pardes, and being able to balance this world and the next, the physical world balanced with the spiritual realm. He recognized that life was a continuum that continues from this world into the next, and therefore was actually able to welcome this kind of situation where he could die al Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name. And as the Kuzari continues on page 376 in our text, with paragraph 66, the Kuzari, after hearing the Khazar king, after hearing this inspiring story about how Rebbe Akiva was tortured by the Romans towards, at the end of his life. He was one of the 10 martyrs. And it was when they got to the place of his tefillin shel rosh, they were combing his skin with these iron torture combs. And when they got to his forehead where he would put on the tefillin, that's where he let out a scream, because he recognized that this was the end of his being able to fulfill that mitzvah, that vital mitzvah. And he knew that the end was near. But then he was able to recite the Shema, the first sentence. And as his soul departs, the Talmud records that a heavenly voice rang out and said, how fortunate you are, Rebbe Akiva, whose life expired while saying the word Echad, which is the affirmation of the unitary God. According to many, it is the most distinctive feature of the God of the Bible, and that's why it was so important or so noteworthy of Rebbe Akiva using that word when his soul was departing. The Talmud also says in this passage in Tractate Brachot that a heavenly voice also rang out and said that fortunate are you, Rebbe Akiva, who was prepared for the very high station in the world to come. And so so in paragraph 66, the Khazar king, hearing about this very impressive report, such a person will live a pleasing life, will die a pleasing death, and will then experience an eternal life of eternal pleasure. So the Khazar king recognizes and appreciates the great caliber of the sage Rebbe Akiva. And as we pointed out last time, our whole context of this discussion is to underscore the great integrity of the rabbis who were in charge of perpetuating rabbinic tradition, our oral tradition, and Rebbe Akiva certainly stands out as one of those most influential and distinctive characters of the Torah Sheba'al Peh project. So we continue and we go to paragraph 67. And we don't have a handout today because I want to be able to cover a little bit more text. The rabbi said, after these sages, the next generation of Tanaim, the word Tana is an Aramaic word for the rabbis who were in charge of transmitting. That's really the word Tana. When you translate it from Aramaic to Hebrew, it means the shoneh, the person who teaches or transmits or passes on the tradition. After these sages, the next generation of Tanaim included Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai, Rabbi Yosei, Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, who's also known just as Ben Azai. He was one of the four who entered into the Pardes. Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan, whose story is well known as far as him being one of the 10 martyrs as well, and their colleagues. And really, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is abbreviating this section because he is being very selective in really trying to choose what he wants to highlight in order to bring across the point of the rabbis being faithful transmitters of the Masorah. And he probably feels that by this time he's demonstrated that, and he knows that we're probably familiar with these very, very big names of the period of the Mishnah. But that's the next generation of Tanoim. And after these came the sage Rebbe, also known as Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy teacher, also known as Rebbe Yehuda HaNasi, Rebbe Yehuda, the president of the Jewish people, Rebbe Yoshua ben Korcha, and many others. These were the authors of the Mishnah, and they were called by the title Tana. Now, in this short little paragraph, Rebbe Yehuda Halevi has covered several centuries. I shouldn't say several. It's really about two centuries he's covered, because the period of the Tanoim begins shortly after the beginning of the Common Era and goes until around the year 200, roughly. So it's about 200 years, which is several generations of Tanoim, but that he's covered in, looking at the life of Rebbe Akiva. Really, that started actually the generation before Rebbe Akiva and goes until the generation of Rebbe Yehuda HaNasi, who is the last generation of the Tanaim and who was known as the redactor of the Mishnah. Those who came in later generations were called by the title Amora, interpreter, and these were the authors of the Gemara. I just wanted a very brief word on the meaning of the word Amora. You will find sometimes that the Gemara uses the word Amora in a completely different context. The word Amora literally means an interpreter. Just going to mute everybody. I hope that's okay. And so what does it mean? The original meaning of the word interpreter is someone who has the ability to project their voice, because this is before the age of microphones and voice amplification, someone who can project their voice very loudly and be able to explain what the person who's speaking, the lecturer, who may have a weaker voice, wishes to get across. So you find therefore the term uki ale amora, that such and such a sage set up an amora as his interpreter, or as the one who would convey the information to the audience. That was the original usage of the word Amora. But the Gemara actually says that the word Amora has a specialized meaning in the context in which Rebbe Yehuda Halevi is using it now. The word Amora also means, depending on the context, a rabbi of the Talmud. And Amora is with a lowercase a or lowercase aleph or an uppercase aleph, even though Hebrew doesn't have uppercases and lowercases, but it depends on the context where we understand what the word Amora means. And here the word Amora means a rabbi from a particular era who comes after the redaction of the Mishnah, after the Mishnah is compiled and put together and the text has been formalized and, so to speak, canonized, if I can use that term. Then all of the rabbis who come after the period of the Mishnah are called the Amoraim. And the reason why they are called Amoraim is because the term Amora is someone who interprets or relays or clarifies the information that they have received from the teacher. And so this signifies that there was a clear recognition that once the Mishnah had been redacted, it had become the canon of oral law for very reasonable reasons, because once something has been solidified as the oral tradition law, you can clarify that law, but if you start to disagree with it, you're going to end up with chaos in Jewish practice. And the goal, of course, is, especially as Jews are being dispersed further and further across the face of the earth at the beginning of the 3rd century of the Common Era, the desire is to unify Jewish practice instead of diversifying it. So the unification of Jewish practice is done by canonizing the Mishnah and declaring that no one has the right to disagree with the laws put down in the Mishnah, but you do have a right to clarify them and elucidate them. And that's what the function of the Amora, which are the rabbis who appear in the Talmud, which is a commentary on the Mishnah. We will also sometimes find that whenever there's a machlokes, if there's a dispute in the Mishnah, you could have one Amora taking sides. And an Amora does have the right to do that as long as he can find support for his opinion in a Mishnah, or on rare occasion, in a text that was written contemporaneously with the Mishnah, which is known as a Breita or a Tosefta. It's rare that that occurs, but the Talmud will sometimes say, hey, what happened? You're going against the Mishnah. And the Gemara's response is, yes, but there is another opinion of a Tana that was not included in the Mishnah, but it is a well-known Breita. It is a well-known text that was also written in that same time. It was known to be part of the oral tradition, and therefore that Amora has a right to side with another opinion that is well known as part of the oral tradition. Okay? But that happens rarely, but it does happen once in a while. Okay, so Rebbe is the name for this Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Now, the project that Rebbe engaged in for a large portion of his life was most likely met with a tremendous amount of controversy, because as some of the Gaonim point out, some of the rabbis who came after the time of the Gemara observe, what Rebbe was engaging in was, in a sense, a violation of a basic principle that we're not supposed to commit oral tradition to one specific text, and we're supposed to keep it as oral as possible. And what Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi, who's known as Rebbe, what essentially he did is that he felt he needed to violate that principle to reduce the orality of the oral law and commit it to one specific text. What was his justification? Eit lasot lashem heferu toratecha. He cited a pasuk that sometimes when you need to act for God, when there is a loosening or a weakening of Torah transmission. And what Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi noted was that in his time, the fact that the oral transmission was purely oral made it more difficult for people in different geographic locations to reliably receive a transmission of an oral tradition that was exclusively oral. And therefore, he felt that he needed to, in some way, create a text that would provide the foundation of all of the oral law. And his objective was to reduce that text to keep it as minimally invasive as possible to the necessity for the law to remain oral. So he created a very terse text so that it orality, which means that even though Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi created a text, he made it very terse, and knowing in advance that anyone who was going to learn this text would require still interaction with a teacher who would elucidate that text in order to make it fully understandable. Now, for the next 300 years, after 300 years or so, about 3 centuries after Rebbe Yehuda Hanasi, that's exactly what the students in the Beit Midrash were doing. They would have the text of the Mishnah, and they would orally elucidate that text to each other. Those conversations that take place over the course of those 3 centuries, from approximately the year 200 to 500 of the Common Era, continue, and there are collections of those discussions and extractions of those discussions, and that's what forms the Talmud, both the Palestinian Talmud, or what's known as Talmud Yerushalmi, and the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli. And the reason why many of those conversations were collected and committed to writing is because as the generations advanced and as populations dispersed further and further, people were forgetting those oral elucidations, and so they needed to commit those oral discussions to writing as well. But that is not the totality of the elucidation of the Mishnah. It was what the rabbis of the time at the very beginning of the 6th century felt needed to be done in order to preserve the foundational clarifications of the Mishnah. But then, of course, there was so much left that was left oral. And that brings us to so many more of the commentaries that are added on to the Talmud, even after the Talmud is canonized and completed. And so you have the period of the Rabbanan Savoroi, which is a century or two after the completion of the Talmud. You have the period of the Gaonim, and then you have which is from around the year 700 or 800 to the beginning of the second millennium, right, to the year 1000, and then the Rishonim from about the year 1000 until the year around approximately 1500. Okay, and so that's sort of the the evolution of our oral transmission, is that we commit things to writing when we're worried that the information will be forgotten or misinterpreted or misrelayed. And we try to preserve, by necessity, some level of orality in every generation. And that's what continues to this very day. And because we recognize that no matter how much you try to elucidate and clarify a teaching, the most effective way to get across an idea is through face-to-face oral transmission, just like we're doing right now, right? Okay, so Rebbe compiled the Mishnah in the year 530 using the reckoning of the documents. Now, just as you note from the footnote, what does the year 530 mean? It's for Minyan Shtarot. Now, that we don't use that calendar system, but rather it is based on the founding of the empire of Alexander the Great, which according to the Rambam began in the year 312 before the Common Era, BCE. So the year 530, according to this reckoning, would be in the year 218 of the Common Era. So what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is sort of doing is he's dating the day or the date, the year when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi redacted the Mishnah, which is approximately the year 220 of the Common Era. Okay, and that was 150 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, and which was also 530 years after the cessation of prophecy. Now, where do you get 150 years after the destruction of the temple? Well, you can do the math. The Second Temple is destroyed in approximately the year 68 or the year 70. And if you add 150 years, you get either 218 or 220. But also 530 years after the cessation of prophecy, because later on in the Kuzari, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is going to, actually, sorry, we saw it already in paragraph 39, that a prophecy ended 40 years after the Second Temple was built. The Second Temple lasted for 420 years. So if you add 380 to 150, which is 150 years after the destruction, plus 380 years of the Second Temple period, you get 530 years. So the reason why Yehuda Halevi wants to make a point of saying that the Mishnah is redacted 530 years after the cessation of prophecy is, as we noted at the very beginning of this whole discussion, which is a polemic against Karaism, is that there's approximately 5 centuries, 500 years of where the oral tradition remains oral. In other words, It starts with the period of when prophecy ends, when we can no longer consult with Shamayim, with heaven, to tell us what the law is, because we have no longer prophets. And so for a period of a bit over 500 years, we are relying on an oral transmission, which is exclusively oral and has remained static and has remained intact for a half of a millennium. Okay. And so, and then it's only after 500 years where Rebbe realizes that there's a slow disintegration or deterioration of that transmission process, and we need to redact the Mishnah. Okay, so there's a lot to say over here about why Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi redacted the Mishnah, but I'm going to leave it at that for now, that it had to do with the breakdown in transmission because of the dispersal of the Jewish people. There may be other factors as well. There may be the fact that, according to some views, the further you move away from a transmission process that has an origin point, the harder it is, as the years go by, the harder it becomes to preserve a tradition, just like the game of telephone, right? Things start to break down generation after generation because it's much harder to preserve. But I believe it more has to do with the fact that Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi observes that in his particular generation, which is the generation after, or a generation or two after the destruction of the temple, it's no longer feasible to assume that because we no longer have a unified seat of government, we no longer have a unified seat of centrality for the Jewish people in the temple, we need to be able to preserve Jewish law as Jews disperse further and further away from the center and move out of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so subparagraph 3 on page 377 says, the sages committed themselves to preserving the Mishnah in the same way they had done for the Torah. They were very meticulous in its composition, its organization, the number of its sections, chapters, and laws, and they took great care to properly attribute authorship to each statement. Because of their exactitude, it is implausible that they could have conspired to transmit anything false. And using this paragraph, it is appropriate to use the term canonization to talk about the Mishnah, even though that word canonize usually is reserved for biblical text. But there is a form of canonization. In other words, the sages viewed it as their task, just like they preserved every single letter of the Sefer Torah, they preserved every single letter and word of the Mishnah in that very same way. Now, of course, there are distinctions. With the Sefer Torah, one of the ways you preserve the integrity of the text is all of the laws of Dikdukei Sofrim, which is, how to write a Sefer Torah, and the laws of scribal halacha and all of that, which does not exist for the Mishnah. There is no requirement to write the Mishnah or transcribe the Mishnah in a certain specific way, on which parchment and which ink and so forth and so on. The same care is not prescribed for transcribing the Mishnah. But nonetheless, if the rabbis viewed it as a canonized text, and therefore they treated it with tremendous sanctity and spared no expense at preserving the integrity of the text. One of the things that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi writes, which is, I think, quite fascinating, is that they took great care to properly attribute authorship to each state, and that is viewed as one way of preserving the integrity of the text. Now note that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's work is written before the Rambam writes his Mishneh Torah, but because Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lives about a half of a century before the Rambam, in as far as age. Now, noting this, I think it's very interesting. One of the great criticisms that the Rambam had to endure when he wrote his Mishneh Torah, which is the first real serious effort of a codex, of a codification of Jewish law, is that he didn't provide attribution of who said what. He basically arbitrated what he felt was the law. He took whichever opinions he felt whenever there was a dispute. He didn't say so-and-so says this and so-and-so says this, but rather he just said, this is the law, without attribution. And that was one of the big criticisms that he received, is that what the halacha should be, and why are you not providing attribution? Because attribution was viewed as being one of the ways of preserving a tradition by making sure that you know who said what. And he didn't do that. And perhaps the reason why he didn't do that, the Rambam, is because he felt that he needed to simplify Jewish law instead of complicating it. And that was the difficulty that he saw that people of his time were having, is that to keep and hold cup in all of the different opinions and all of the different people who said what, when it comes to tachlis and you want to be able to know, what am I supposed to do? How many candles do I light on Hanukkah? It's not necessary to know who says what, just this is the law, right? You don't need to know about a machloket between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel if we're codifying law. And that's why the Rambam omitted it. But, and so therefore, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, however, is talking about how the rabbis were so careful to preserve even attribution of who said what, because he feels that that's another way of demonstrating how the rabbis took great care to preserve the integrity of the text. Okay. He then says in subparagraph number 4 that many Hebrew terms that are not from scripture were included in the Mishnah to add to its fluid readability. And as we point out in the footnotes, there's a statement that the Gemara itself makes, the Talmud itself makes, that the language of the Torah is one way and the language of the sages is another way, which is just really a point that Mishnaic Hebrew is a modernized form of Hebrew. It's not identical to biblical Hebrew. It's a completely different style and a different dialect of Hebrew. And there are many more words in the vocabulary that exist in the Mishnaic text than exist in the biblical text. Now, as you may recall, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was of the opinion earlier in the Kuzari that the Hebrew dictionary is not limited to the words that appear in Tanakh. The Hebrew dictionary is actually much larger. It just so happens that the words that are contained in Tanakh were the words necessary to convey whatever information is contained in Tanakh. But there may be many, many more Hebrew words that existed, that just, if there was a certain kind of washing instrument, for example, that existed in biblical times and everyone knew what that was, or a certain type of ornament or a piece of jewelry or whatever it was that existed, just because it doesn't appear in biblical text does not mean that there wasn't a word for it in Hebrew. And so many of the words that the sages use were known to them. It's not that they invented them like Ben Yehuda when the state of Israel was founded in the 20th century, where he was faced with the dilemma of that there were so many new things and that Hebrew just didn't have a word for, and he had to make up words, right? So like tomatoes, there was no such word. There was never a Hebrew word for tomatoes, so he had to make up agvaniot, right? And so many other words like that. But Rabbi Yehuda Halevi maintains, even though the language of the Mishnah is quite different from biblical Hebrew, its syntax and the way that it uses certain conjugations and so forth, it doesn't necessarily mean that the rabbis invented new Hebrew words. They may have taken words that were well known and added them to the Mishnah. Its concise style, its beautiful composition and structure, its inclusion of all sides of an issue along with a legal conclusion, all these prove without a doubt to anyone who examines it with a discriminating eye that no human being could compose such a work without divine aid. That's a very important claim. And I just want to, I think we're coming up to the half hour. I don't want to take too much time on this subject, but I'm going to read that sentence again. What Rabbi Yehuda Halevi he's just made a very bold statement that when you look at the quality of the text and how impressive it is, you come to the conclusion that God must have assisted this project because mere mortals could not have put together such a perfect text. Now, what does that sound like? Can anyone tell me what that is reminiscent of? Perhaps in another religion? Anyone? Anyone want to put forward a suggestion? Okay, maybe we'll leave it here and pick up on this next time. But those of you who are students of the Quran, and I don't see too many on the call, but that is one of the faith claims of Islam, is that the proof that the Quran is of divine origin is based on the fact that no human being could possibly have written such a perfect text. It's quite interesting that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is living in an Islamic land and uses that very same argument. And so we have to be careful with this argument because it could be used by other faiths to make faith claims about texts that are not part of the Jewish canon. Okay, so just keep that in mind, and we'll maybe pick up on this next time. Okay, so let's go on to our discussion of the Parsha, and we'll talk about, let me just bring it up. We'll talk about Parshas Vayishlach for today. Let's see here. Just give me a moment. I'll share my screen with you. Can everyone see my screen? I have a new thing with my, okay, you got it. All right, I have a new thing with my, because I'm working with two different monitors, so I'm glad that you can see it. Okay, I think I'm actually going to move it down to this monitor. Okay, better. But you can also, I hope you're well. Whoops. But, okay. Wait a minute. But you can all see. I hope you're well. Whoops. Okay, sorry about that. I'm a little bit technologically challenged over here, but I think we're okay. Okay, so here we go.
I can't see it.
You're not able to see it. Okay, let me move it back. You're not able to see it.
I can just see two lines at the top. That's it.
All right. So just give me a moment here, please. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Oh boy. I really messed myself up here. I'm sorry. Let me stop the share for a moment. And let me try this again. Are you able to see it now?
Yeah, now we can see it.
Now you can see it. Parshat Vayishlach, challenges to our faith and how to respond to them. Okay, so we are all familiar with the story of Yaakov's wrestling match with the angel. It's one of the things that I wanted to discuss today, but just to give us a spin on it and how we can use it to deal with some of the challenges that we may encounter in our own lives. Here we go. All right, now I think I got it. Okay, So Yaakov, Vayivater Yaakov levado, Yaakov is left alone. And the reason why he's left alone, according to Rashi, is that he sent his family across the river or across the wadi, and he remains behind to pick up what little utensils that are still left on the other side. And as a result, Vaye avek ish imo ad alot hashachar, and a man wrestles with him until the coming of the dawn. Now, in past years, we have portrayed this man as being an angel, and some say that, as Rabbeinu Bechaya documents, that this angel was actually coming to Yaakov's aid to try to force Yaakov, instead of running under the cover of night, to evade Esav, but rather, no, I'm going to pin you down and force you to continue traveling in the middle of the daylight, so that you won't be able to evade Esav, because your destiny is to confront Esav. So that's certainly, and therefore this angel is portrayed as a very helpful angel. Either it's portrayed as the angel Michael, some call it the angel Gabriel, but it's basically on Yaakov's side. But then there's another tradition, which is probably even a better known tradition, and that this angel is Esav's angel and represents the angel Samael. Samael is also known as the Yetzer Hara, and that's the approach, the evil inclination, and that's the approach that the Kli Yakar and so many other commentaries take. And I just wanted to share with you some select passages from the Kli Yakar's commentary. He says, Achar shehiskimu rov hameforshim shemalach zehu Samael, that most of the commentaries say that this angel is Samael, Saro shel Esav hanikra Samael Esav, that this is the angel of Esav. Ki kol cheftzo v'yisho l'samei einei ha'adam, because the whole objective of this angel, who embodies what Esav tries to do to Yaakov, is to blind the human eye. Ulahakato be'ivaron v'la'asoto suma me'ein hasichli, that it is to blind a person and to make him not be able to see with his eye of his intellect, meaning that the human being many times succumbs to a certain kind of blindness because of the physical trappings of this world around us that provide us with one perspective of reality, and that can sometimes blind us to the real reality of who we are and where we live. To the point where the person who is blinded by Samael can no longer see the truth. The remez ledavar ki Samael shutafo shel anavim ba'alphabeta ve'otiot shniyot. He says one of the ways to get an allusion to that is if you take the letters Samech, Mem, Aleph, Lamed, which not only come from the word to be misameh, to blind, but if you take the letter that comes after Samech, you get Ayin. You take the letter that comes after Mem, you get Nun. The letter that comes after Aleph is Bet. The letter that comes after Lamed is Mem. And what does that spell? That spells Anavim. What are Anavim? Anavim are grapes. They are the base ingredient for manufacturing wine. Ki kamo shahayayin hayotze min ha'anavim, kishehu meshaker et ha'adam harehu iver bistam einav. He says, because that's what wine does. Wine basically dumbs us down when we become intoxicated and makes us blind to the reality that our intellects can provide us. Ustam shikor holech ki iver v'suma. And when a person is shikar, they walk around like a blind person. Kach Samael zeh shutafo, kol mezimotav l'samei einei ha'adam. And that's the objective of Samael, to blind human beings, ad asher lo yuchal lirot et hashemesh, to the point where they can no longer see the sun representing the clarity of vision of what reality really is. V'imkein ha'anavim mesamim ein hagishmi, v'zeh samael shutafo me'aver ein hasichli. So therefore, just like wine perverts our physical vision, everything gets blurry, right? So too, Samael blinds our intellectual eye. Shelo yireh b'marot hakel, v'zehu Samael milah murkevet. And that's why the word Samael is a contraction of two words, lisame and el, because Samael blinds us to the reality of God. That's the whole idea of this angel. The angel wrestling with Yaakov is therefore an angel that is attempting to try and cause Yaakov to lose his religious perspective, to lose his sight on God and everything that surrounds that. Now, so that's the first point that the Kli Yakar makes. Va'od, so Yaakov is going through an existential struggle because there's an attempt made to get him to detach his vision of God, his understanding of God. Va'od mima shetzarich sheteidaehu, shehayetzer hara nimshal lizvuv. He says, the next thing I want you to know is that the evil inclination is compared to a fly, and which is a very interesting analogy to make. I mean, if you were to compare the Yetzer Hara to a pesky insect, why not compare the Yetzer Hara to a bee or to a wasp or to another kind of more dangerous insect? Kasher pirashti lamayla parshat bereshit b'pasuk lapetach chatat rovetz. As I explained when I talked about the passage having to do with Cain and God speaking to Cain, that the evil inclination is compared to a fly that's a pesky, kind of distracting bug. Ki stam zvuv ino rovetz bebasar hashalem sheba adam. He says, one thing that's noteworthy is that a fly does not gravitate to unbroken skin. Ki ein kocho bepiv la'asot petach chadash bebasar shalem. Because a fly does not have a stinger. A fly does not have the ability to puncture skin that is sealed. Al kein hazavuv rovetz bein hasfatayim b'makom shemotzei petach patuch ktsat sham yirbatz laharchiv petach hamaka. But what a fly does do is it looks for an opening. The fly will look for a place where there is an open wound or where there's open flesh, and that's where the flies swarm, right? So that's why flies gravitate towards, let's say, a carrion or a corpse only after the vultures have started to peck away at the open skin, right? And then the fly smells the blood and it comes to leach off of areas of where the flesh is now exposed. So kacha yetzer hara eino mizdaveg el ha'adam hashalem asher lo paratz gidro klal v'lo patach lo petach lechatat v'lanida. And therefore, that's the way the Yetzer Hara works. When a human being is intact and has nothing broken about them, everything is sealed and intact, so then the Yetzer Hara has no dominion. V'im ha'ish hashalem b'chol ma'asav ein lo shum shayachut ve'esek ki lo yacholo klal. And that's the reason, essentially, the Yetzer Hara cannot have any effect on a person who is complete and does not have any vulnerabilities. But ach bizman shahadam me'atzmo poteach lo petach ktsat uporetz gidro af ba'avera kala. So therefore, the Yetzer Hara comes just like the fly when the person himself has created a break in the skin, where I've created a break in my armor because I've done something minor on my own, okay? Az miyad mizdaveg lo hayetzer hara va'omer lo ach atzmi uvesari ata. The Yetzer Hara comes along and says, Chevraman, we are kindred spirits. Va'az ya'aleh min ha'averot hakalot el hachamurot. And that's how a person can spiral out of control. It has to start with some small violation, and then it spirals out of control through the efforts of the Yetzer Hara to widen that gap and to invade further and further. Umishtadel laharchiv harpirtza ad alot chamas gever le'in mirpa uparatz gidro v'haya lemirmas. And quoting a pasuk in Isaiah, he poetically describes that action of how the Yetzer Hara penetrates deeper and deeper and expands that chasm further and the wound further. And that's how a person spirals out of control. And he says, Kach zeh hamalach Samael, saro shel Esav, bir'oto inyane Yaakov im Esav, shehem tuliyim b'shmirat HaTorah. Now, the angel of Esav took note of the fact through the blessings that were given to Yaakov and Esav that Yaakov's ascendancy was directly dependent upon his compliance with the Torah. Kemo shenemar v'haya ka'asher tarid ufarakto ulome al tzavarecha. That God, through Yitzchak's blessing to Esav was that when Yaakov will have some kind of downfall spiritually, then Esav will be able to throw off the yoke of subservience to Yaakov and will have ascendancy himself. And that was really the whole objective of this angel of Esav, was to find that weak spot, that Achilles heel within Yaakov, so that Esav could have ascendancy. V'hinei kol zman shelo hibit aven b'Yaakov klal, lo nizdaveg alav l'samei et einei sichlo mikol v'chol. But so long as Yaakov had a pristine character and his behavior was perfect, there was no opening for this Yetzer Hara to attack. Ach keshera sheYaakov paratz gidro ktsat b'yetziazu, ki chanan oto Elokim v'natan lo et kol v'rov osher unechasim v'chavod. He says, what happens? Yaakov is in a stage of his life where he is experiencing tremendous wealth because he's just left Lavan's house and he's got a huge camp of livestock and servants and Kanai Nahara, a beautiful family. And he's got all of this, and God has granted him this. The Yaakov yatsa migeder ha'istapkut ktsat. And this was the vulnerable spot at this particular juncture, where Yaakov remains behind and decides that he's going to go back for the small containers that are part of his estate. And this is where Yaakov, according to the Kli Yakar, shows a weakness. His weakness is that he feels that he's got to grab everything, and is now living in a luxurious way where he's not he's not mistapek b'mu'at is the Hebrew term. He doesn't feel that he can subsist on very little, because now he's become accustomed to the luxury of abundance, and that's the weak spot. Okay, and that's a very cautionary tale, of course, to all of us. And at that point, once the Yetzer Hara, once Samael finds that weak spot, Vayivater Yaakov levado, that Yaakov is left alone, he's vulnerable. Uva'avur davar mu'at ha'achuz b'chav levuz notar bimkom sakana levado. He remains alone in a dangerous state. Az amar Samael he'ach matzati avenli me'achar sheYaakov hitchil bekalkala ve'asa et atzmo ktsat iver me'einav. I found an opening. Found an opening. Yaakov has already started this process of degradation. Let me go and attack. Kimi iver kamo ohave hamamon. He says, because there is no one that is more blind than those who love money, those who love material gain. And so therefore, when Samuel sees that Yaakov has begun down this road in a very, very small way, he says, I got him. He's mine. Asher alehem ne'emar ve'enei ha'adam lo tisba'ena. As we know in Proverbs, it says that a human being will never be sated with this material world. So azamar Samael, hine'et lekarev ve'et lechabek elav, ve'hineni mosif lo tuma lemalot enav avak ve'afar, kidei sheyeh suma mikol v'chol gam me'en asichli. This is my opportunity now to blind Yaakov further and to take away his intellectual eye through which he can see God clearly. Miyad vaye avek ish imo, and that's when he starts to wrestle with him. Nizdaveg elav Samael ligrom lo shichachat eloka mikol v'chol. And Samael's project, therefore, was to completely blind Yaakov from seeing God in the world. All it takes is just a little bit of weakness towards material things in this world, and then we've got you. That's the message of the Kli Yakar so far. And he says the word Vaye Avek is written with the letter Aleph, Kidei lidrosh mimenu lashon avak, because it implies that there's dust being kicked up in this wrestling match. Ki ratza l'samei ein sichlo ke'avak zeh ha'oleh u'misamei einei ha'adam. He says, because if you think of a dust storm in the desert, what does it do? It completely blinds you, makes you oblivious to your surroundings. Kach ala b'dato l'samei ein sichlo kidei lahavi'o lidei ha'chashat elokam imal. And that was the effort. The effort was to make him deny God. V'zeh shamru chazal shehaya ha'avak oleh ad kisei ha'kavod. And that's why our sages in the Talmud say that this dust that they kicked up went all the way up to the divine throne in heaven. What does that mean? It doesn't mean, you can't explain it literally, but what it means is ki zehu simui einav shel tzidkiyahu hanogea ba'atzamot emunat haborit barach u'mitziut kisei kavodo yitbarach. In reference to Tzidkiyahu HaMelech, who also had this same challenge of faith, it's basically suggesting that it was difficult for Yaakov to have proper perspective, to be able to properly see God's divinity in this world, because the dust was accumulating between himself and God's throne. And just one final paragraph, he says, Umasha amru shahaya nogea b'kisei hakavod lamdu ze mima shenemar ad alot hashachar. And how do we know? How does the Talmud know that this is that this was how dire things were for Yaakov during this wrestling match, that he was starting to even have doubts about God himself? Is because the Torah says, if you go back to the verse, it says, Vaye avek ish imo ad alot hashachar, that a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. Now, so what do you see from there? Mashma ad velo ad bichlal. It means all the way up until the break of dawn, but by the break of dawn, Yaakov had clarity again. Ki alot hashachar haya me'akev al yado, shelo haya yachol lahavio lidei hakchashat eloka. Because by the break of dawn, that's when Yaakov was shaken free of this wrestling match, of this hold that Samuel had on him. So therefore, he no longer could completely deny God. Lefisha al yedei alot hashachar hikir be'emet, because it was with the break of dawn that he recognized the truth. Ki yesh la'olam borei umanhig, that the world has a creator who through his providence guides the world along on its course, on its trajectory. Kemo shepiresh ba'akeda parshat bereshit al pasuk v'yadata hayom v'hashevota el levavecha ki Hashem hu ha'elokim. He says the commentary, the Sefer Ha'akedah, which predates the Kli Yakar, says that on those words, you shall know today, and you shall restore this to your heart, that God is the Lord. That how does he explain this verse? That you shall know today, shemitoch yidiat mahalach hagalgal hayomi dahainu hashemesh, that all you have to do is observe the daytime activities of the sun. That's why it says you shall know today. In other words, look at what happens over the course of the day. Look at the motion of the sun. Yuchal hamaskil hitbonen ki Hashem hu ha'elokim. That just observing how the world operates and how there seems to be such order and mechanism to the way that the world operates implies to the observer that the world has some kind of clockmaker who is creating this whole process. Lekach ne'amar ad alot hashachar velo ad bichlal. And that's why it says that he had these doubts, the dust of doubt, until the break of dawn, but not at the break of dawn. Ki al yedei yediat tenuat hashemesh, once Yaakov sees the sun rising, yada Yaakov ki Hashem hu ha'elokim. He was able to immediately recognize that God is the Lord. Now, a couple of points, and with this we will conclude because it's getting late. Now that you've seen the Kli Yakar's approach, and we've only extracted a little bit because the Kli Yakar has much more to say about this point, I will just say two more things. One is, and I'll just say it outside because we don't have time, the Shem Mishmuel points out that the weakening that Samuel presented to Yaakov was not Yaakov personally, but was rather the future descendants of Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov, the man himself, was never moved or never flinched because of this wrestling match, but it was rather a weakness that was inserted in Yaakov's future descendants. And as the Sfarim say, that the angel was able to affect what's called the Midat HaNetzach, the attribute of Netzach, which means eternity, or being able to maintain that constancy of faith, in that what Samuel does to the descendants of Yaakov, to the Jewish people, is that our faith ebbs and flows. Netzach, that word represents constancy, and because Samuel was successful in affecting the future descendants of the Jewish people, every single Jew will ebb and flow in their faith over the course of a lifetime. We have times when we are stronger in our faith, and there are times when we are weaker in our faith. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is very, very simple. Using this cue from the Kli Yakar, that Yaakov's faith is shaken until the rise of the dawn, it appears to me that there's another way of interpreting until the break of dawn. It's not just because Yaakov observes the motion of the sun. And this, to me, is how I interpret this message of until the break of dawn. We go through existential crises of faith all of the time. We have questions, we have doubts. But once the dawn breaks, for me as a Jewish man, I have to go to Shacharis. I got to wake up after all the questions that have been buzzing through my head all night. I've got to get up, get dressed, go to Minyan, put on my tefillin and talis and daven. And I believe that one of the ways, and this is discussed in many Sfarim, that one of the ways to respond to challenges of our faith are that it's okay for those questions to linger. As long as there may not be constancy of faith, but there needs to be constancy of practice. There needs to be a constancy of going through the motions and the movements of Judaism, of Jewish halacha, of Jewish practice. Because if we allow our behaviors to be dependent upon our faith, then as our faith ebbs and flows, so will our practices ebb and flow. And this will result in a breakdown of our commitment to live a life of integrity that is unshaken by those questions to our faith. And perhaps what it means that a man wrestled with him until dawn is that Yaakov said to the angel, we've been having these really interesting discussions about whether there is a God, whether there's not a God, whether God's providential, whether he's not providential, why bad things happen to good people, all of the basic questions that start to shake people's faith, right? But you know what? I got to go to Minyan. It's the dawn has broken, and it's time to go, and it's time to do what I need to do over the course of the day, whether it's going to shul, or whether it's going to bring the korbanot, et hakeves echad ta'aseh v'boker, ve'et hakeves hasheni ta'aseh bin ha'arbayim, bring the morning sacrifice, bring the afternoon sacrifice. That sense of constancy has been the key to our survival. The key to our survival has not been the unbroken chain of faith, because the chain is broken all the time through individuals who go through various iterations of doubt throughout their lives. But it is the constancy of practice. And it is the key to the survival of the Jewish people, is that constancy of practice. So that's the message of challenges to our faith and how to respond to them. Make sure that you continue having those questions and struggling with them. But when it's time to daven, make sure you pick up, you put down the book on philosophy, and you pick up the siddur, and you go at it. Okay, comments, let's take a look. I'm sorry. Ki adam ein tzadik ba'aretz asher ya'aseh tov v'lo yecheta. There's no such thing as King Solomon wrote, as a person who only does good and never sins. I guess this refers to us regular folk, but not to our avot. We are all subject to the fly. Indeed, we are. We are all subject to the fly. And that's an important point to make. Thank you. And let me just see if there's anything on the chat. No, nothing on the chat. Okay, at least not that I can see. So anyway, everyone have a wonderful day. We've already gone over time.
Sorry about that. I'm a little bit.
And we'll see you, Mitzvah Shem, next time. Take care, everybody.